So let me ask you this. Who do you trust? Now, before you answer, I want you to think about this. These are the people who have the keys to your house. These are the people who have the password to your phone. These are the people who know the PIN for your ATM. Who do you trust? No one. I hear it. There you go. Not even myself. I can't ever remember that PIN or where I put my keys to your house. No. Why do we struggle to trust people? Have people become less trustworthy? Or have we become less trusting? And possibly for good reason. Maybe there have been enough times that people have let us down that we've become a little gun-shy. Here's a specific area. It's been kind of pointed out to me that I probably haven't talked about this enough, and so I'll talk about it today. I told you last week there's 3 topics we're not supposed to talk about from the pulpit. Hell, which I talked about last week, and money, which we talk about pretty regularly, and politics, which I don't say much about, so let me say something about it. Who will you trust with your vote? I'm grateful for the opportunity to vote. Personally, I no longer trust that my vote counts, just to be honest. Lately, I've listened to both presidential candidates warn or promise us or warn us that they alone stand as democracy's last hope. If these are the 2 individuals we can put our hope in, and they are our last hope, it's pretty hopeless. And I would probably say that about any candidate you'd put up there, to be honest with you. Probably because I'm not as trusting, and probably because most people that get to that level are probably not as trustworthy as I'd like them to be. So I've doubted whether democracy even still lives in our republic. Well, I will vote, and I encourage each of you to do the same. I can't help but wonder about the integrity of our elections, and have long ago stopped placing my hope and trust in our system. So let me talk about that. In 1988, I cast my first vote in a presidential election via an absentee vote from college. You could do absentee ballots even in 1988. And I was excited. My candidate won. And for a brief moment, I was hopeful. I had cast my vote. I was part of the winner's circle. There was a winner. And then I took out my very first student loan for just over $2,000 at 12% interest. We fondly refer to those as the good old days. The good old days of Reaganomics. The national debt, when I cast that vote in 1988, was $2.6 billion, an unimaginable number. Shortly after my vote, we invaded Iraq. And by the time I voted again 4 years later in 1992, our national debt had nearly doubled to $4 billion. Oh, how would we ever recover from $4 billion? And here's the interesting thing about 1992. For the first time since Ike, not the hurricane, but the president, for the first time since Eisenhower, our national debt made up 61% of our GDP. Usually it's right around 30%. I cast my second presidential vote for the losing candidate in 1992. And those results crushed my spirit. I was at seminary at the time, and we had a brown bag lunch, went to this little student lounge, sat around tables a lot like this, and in little small groups like this, and our doctrine professor actually called this meeting to order, and we had this little conversation, and I was disappointed because I seemed to be one of a handful of people who were disappointed with the results of the election. Like maybe one out of every table here was disappointed with who was going to be our new president as of 1992. And 5 of the 6 around the table were ecstatic that we finally had a Christian in the White House. And after listening to students on both sides, I don't count Perot because even though he took up 20% of the vote and probably was the deciding factor in the vote, I'm just still saying both sides. Because I'm not really sure what side Perot was on, other than he drew a really large crowd on TV at the time, if you remember that. But I listened to groups on both sides make the case regarding their candidate as the only biblical option. And my mind was a blender. How can people read the same Bible I read and walk away with such different conclusions? Clearly, I wasn't in South Dakota anymore. I was in Tennessee. Then I heard a voice of wisdom that began as a huge belly laugh. I don't know. Alvin, could you give us a huge belly laugh? I don't know if you have one. Yeah, that's nothing. That's an ant compared to an elephant compared to Fred Norris's belly laugh. And Fred, Tom, you remember this? Maybe he was still laughing that way when you were there too. We went to the same seminary. But Fred, it started as and it just grew. It grew and grew and grew, and then he drew us in with a whisper. Now you have to understand, things were heated around the tables, and Fred just started laughing, and he was the only one in the room. Like, faces were red and tempers were blaring, like just raging. These were all people preparing for ministry for the most part. These were all people with similar biblical values that read in the same book, studying it from the same professors, letting it transform their hearts and minds, surrendered completely to Jesus, and on completely different sides in 1992 as to who should be our president. Dr. Norris seemed to anticipate this ahead of time, so a couple of weeks before the election, he scheduled this little lunch. It wasn't about who was going to be president. It was about the impact it was going to have on our ability to be a community of faith growing to serve Jesus together. And so he started this little lunch and learn with just a simple question. He says, so what do you think about last night's election results? That's all he said. And for 45 minutes, people were just duking it out around their tables. Once upon a time, I guess I'll just mention this, but when he said last night's election results, like once upon a time, an election was decided on election day. You knew who your president was going to be the next day. Although we had some guy named Chad that got hung up for a while about that time frame, hanging Chads. Dr. Norris sat back, watched the melee, and then he started to chuckle. And then we all started laughing. We realized we'd been had. He knew how we were going to respond. He'd paid attention in class when he heard the different political viewpoints around the tables and everything. He knew that not everybody was as committed to the religious right was really just kind of becoming a thing at the time, if you remember right. This was the early days of the religious right. And he knew that some of us had come from churches where essentially you were part of the religious right or the irreligious wrong. And that's my church in a T that I grew up in. As a matter of fact, the youth minister of the Baptized that I love dearly, he's part of a political action committee now that's part of James Dobson's group. All he does is travel around the state of South Dakota and talk about abortion. It's the only issue. By the way, I think that's a very important issue. Not a bad thing to commit your life to, but I want you to understand that the leadership of our church And the leadership of much of the church in the late 80s and early 90s, there was the religious right and there was the irreligious wrong. It wasn't right and left, it was right and wrong. And that's the way we came to the table that day. And so once we all started laughing with Fred, realizing we'd been had, Fred stopped laughing. We stopped laughing, and Fred just simply whispered. And he leaned in, and he quoted the psalm that John read this morning, which is a very political psalm. Understand that Psalm 20 was, whether it was written by the king or in honor of the king, it was a prayer for the king. But do we understand that at that time, the king was seen as an instrument of God, as much a prophet as king? The king brought godly leadership to the country. And so to say God saved the king, whether by prayer or as a victory chant, whatever, it was a way of acknowledging that the highest authority of the land was under higher authority. So when he finished the psalm, he asked us if we were ready to pray. Not talk, but pray. And we actually were. We'd had it out with one another. We'd had a good laugh at our own foolishness. And we were willing to humble ourselves. And I would say that our prayers at that point in time had a much deeper, richer tone. A tone of repentance and confession and conviction. And ultimately, thanks to Fred Norris and David's psalm that simply said, some trust in horses and some trust in chariots, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And I think at that point our prayers must have been far more pleasing to our Father than our arguments ever were. Fred wrapped up our prayer time with a gentle but profound reminder that has completely changed my political perspective. It's why I say I no longer place my hope and trust in our political system. Instead, I question, and I pray, and I surrender. Here's what Fred said that day. He says, as citizens of a greater kingdom, we may vote for a president, but we trust in our king. And so this is my response. This is what you get from me when it comes to political preaching. We don't serve the donkey, we don't serve the elephant, we serve the Lion of Judah. And he roars. Now, I want you to have a strong opinion. Your faith should formulate your opinion, and it should inform your vote. It should form your vote. You should pray. You should ask. You should question. You should pray, and you should surrender. That's also a great formula, not just for dealing with political turmoil, but for personal turmoil. Now, some will look at today's culture and say, where is God? I don't see him. Or some will look at today's circumstances and say, where is God? I don't see him. We're going to talk about that today. But it's the same basic formula. Ask, pray, surrender. Ask. Donald and his mom and I sat down and had lunch one day, and she talked about how the church she grew up in, the priests and the church leaders said, don't ask questions of God. I just want you to know it's okay to ask questions of God. We're looking at that throughout this series. You know, this is like the third question of God that we've asked about. In Psalm 20, the King David sounds really confident, but if you read some of his other Psalms, he asks questions of God on a regular basis. And John's right. In Psalm 20, this is the kind of prayer or the psalm that was prayed or celebrated in worship before the kings went out to battle, which, by the way, in those days, the kings went to battle with their people. You didn't say, we're going to send troops to the Ukraine and then not go. You went with. That's a very different political decision when you're going to be on the line, when your life's out there too. But Psalm 20, in a lot of ways, is David's declaration of dependence. And it will not only have a powerful impact on David and kings going to battle, but as John has pointed out, it should impact us in the way that we go and deal with our battles every day, especially in this election cycle. I believe it'll build your faith for whatever battle you're fighting. Part of the beauty of the Psalms as a whole, you might remember this from the series, but it shows up in this one and almost all the Psalms, is that the psalmist will often start with a question, and they'll start with a doubt and a struggle. And the psalm will show growth in their faith in the midst of it. Because that's what questions do. When we go ahead and ask the questions, we grow into the answers. Like the psalmist, most of us start from some sort of position of disbelief and move towards belief. The Psalms often will say things like, I'm not sure I can trust in God. And then they move to this place where they confidently claim, I know I can trust in God. They grow in their faith and faithfulness, and that's what I want for us today. That's what I want us to talk about at the end of the message today. Rather than me having a discussion with all of you, you're going to talk a little bit around your tables about how you've grown to trust this God. I want you to move from I'm not sure I can trust God to I know I can trust God. And some of you have been there before, but whatever circumstances you're in today, it's like, yeah, I could trust him with all these other things, but this one's major. I get that. But he's the same God, even if the circumstances are different. So how do we move from disbelief to trust? It's a simple process. You could probably already guess it because I've mentioned it twice already. You question. Don't be afraid to ask. And you pray. And you surrender. It's not rocket science. It's a pattern demonstrated throughout the Bible and human history. Let's just start with a king who learned to trust God after many seasons of doubt and disbelief, like David. That's who we're talking about. In Psalm 20, verse 7, he says, some trust in chariots and some in horses, but we trust in the name of the Lord our God. And when I hear that, I think, well, I've never put my trust in a horse. As a matter of fact, I have a lot of mistrust of horses because of a couple of really bad experiences I won't tell you about today. But when you've been hurt by something, you tend to shy away from it and find a hard time trusting it. And so, if you get bucked off of a horse or like I did, you lose your trust. Some trust in horses, some trust in chariots. Never been in a chariot. But we had a Subaru, and when we were first married, I've told you this story, so I'll give you the short version. I drove it under a Mack truck. I learned to not trust in Mack trucks because they hurt me, right? So here's the thing, though. I still tend to be like this psalmist, some trust. I tend to be one of those that trust. I'm part of the some. Like I tend to trust in the things that I can see, and the things I can touch, the things I can feel. That's just who I tend to be. How about you? You tend to trust the things you can see and feel. Today I want to encourage you to trust the unseen and forget about what you think you see. Because I don't know about you, but I'm starting to understand that some of the stuff I see, I maybe shouldn't believe. I wish somebody would mention this to one of our candidates, because honestly, the whole cat-dog meme thing that's going around in conversation, I think could maybe have been prevented if somebody would just point out that not everything you see is real, especially on social media, especially on the internet. Now, I'm not saying that there's not a terrible problem in Springfield, Ohio. I'm not even saying there aren't people out there cooking pets. I'm just saying if you're trying to reach out to the middle of the country, not to the far right or the far left, you probably might be wise to avoid some of those things that are being put out there, right? And that's true for both candidates. But sometimes I think we ought to put less trust in what we see and trust what we don't see yet a little bit more. Do you remember how the author of Hebrews defined faith in Hebrews 11:1? He just basically said this, and this is a different translation than you're used to, and that's on purpose because most of you can quote this particular verse. Now, faith is. But I want to read to you from the New Living Translation. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. It is the evidence of things we cannot see. Now, that's a little different twist from the way you normally quote that verse, but I think it's worth pondering and thinking about a little bit. Faith shows the reality of what we hope for. Most people think that hope is just fiction. It's a false reality. But the truth is, these things that you hope for, that's what's real. And that faith is the evidence of things that we don't see. And I actually prefer a translation that says yet at the end. We don't see it yet, because you're probably going to see it. But the reality of our hope is this invisible evidence of God. So how can we live in hope and trust in God? In other words, why should I put my trust in God? Well, here's how you grow to put your trust in a God you can't see. The first one is you question. It's okay to ask questions. That's the place we start. As a matter of fact, I don't know if you remember this, but remember when Jesus was talking about prayer in the Sermon on the Mount, and we think of this in regards to prayer, but it's just a great process to think about also in developing our faith. He said, now, ask and you'll receive. So does Jesus think it's a good thing to ask God things? Yeah. Seek, you'll find. Knock, nobody come to the door anymore. No. Yeah, you'll have the door opened. They used to do that in cultures when you knock on a door. Ask. Every discovery begins with an honest question. You can't expect to grow if you're not willing to ask that question. So is it okay to question God? Yes. Beyond a shadow of a doubt, yes. Jesus said, question God. He even asked God a couple of questions. Remember the garden? Lord, if it's possible. Father, if it's possible. So as we studied the Psalms last year, we watched David, a man after God's own heart, question God over and over again. And I would just say this. If it was okay for David, a man after God's own heart, to question God, so can you. There was a rabbi, Abraham Joshua Heschel, who said, we're closer to God when we're asking questions than when we think we hold all the answers. What do you think about that? That's not the kind of faith I grew up with, by the way. The faith I grew up with, the church I went to, you were told to come to church and leave your questions at the door. These are the answers. But I don't know that that's the way Jesus taught. He was not opposed to the idea of just giving us questions. He taught with questions over and over. It wasn't because he didn't know the answers. He just knew the power of a really good question. And that's why I think he said in Mark chapter 9, I've got ahead of myself. Matthew chapter 7, I didn't put this one up there. Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 and 8. Ask and it will be given to you, seek and you'll find, knock and the door will be open. For everyone who asks receives, the one who seeks finds. To the one who knocks, the door will be open. See, we think of that in the terms of prayer, but I want you to think about it in terms of what Jesus is saying here. He's been teaching about what it means to be a part of this new kingdom. That's what the Sermon on the Mount is all about, this upside-down kingdom, where it's okay to ask. Now, this doesn't necessarily, when it says, for everyone who asks, receives. That doesn't necessarily mean for everybody that asks for a new car, they receive a new car. You get a car, you get a car, you get a car. That's not what he's saying. But when you ask, you're going to receive. You know what you'll receive? In part, an answer. But sometimes that answer doesn't come right away, and so you have to take the next step and you have to seek. And we'll talk a little about that in a moment, this progression. Perhaps instead of just thinking of this ask principle as something as a gimme principle, God give me this, we should think about it from the standpoint of God wants us to ask. And you know what you have to do to ask? You have to formulate a good question. You have to think. And God wants you to think. He gave you that brain for a reason. And so we get a chance to look closer and understand the principles that he's trying to teach us to guide us in our spiritual development. So you have a question, ask God. Struggling to understand, seek God's help. And that's prayer. A lot of people think prayer is ask. That's part of it. But I also think you're supposed to formulate that prayer, which means thinking about it. So let's talk about this seeking God's help. I'm going to try to back up one slide. In Mark chapter 9, there's this desperate dad that comes to Jesus. And I know a lot of you are going to read this story and think, oh, well, he's just the father of a teenager, right? Because he says, it's often, he says, my kid has a demon, my son has a demon, and sometimes it throws him into the fire, and he just acts all crazy. And some people are like, yeah, I remember those years. That's called adolescence. That's what puberty does to you. It throws you into the fire. It makes you feel like it, at least, both as a parent and as a kid. But that's not really what this guy was dealing with. If you don't know the story, he had a son, this dad had a son who was dealing and battling with an evil spirit. And that evil spirit was causing seizures and convulsions and causing the kid to foam at the mouth and do crazy stuff. And the dad told Jesus about this evil spirit and described it. And what does the dad do? Well, he starts with a question in verse 22. But if you can do anything, you get the question? Do you see the question? Can you do anything? If you can do anything. So what do? You ask and then you pray. If you don't know what to do, you ask God for wisdom. If you're hurting, you cast your cares on God. Why? Because he cares for you. And then you pray. Look at our text. This hurting dad wonders if Jesus, this is in Mark 9, this hurting dad wonders if Jesus can do anything, and Jesus responds. But his response is a little different than you might expect. This is an interesting one to read in multiple translations. If you can, said Jesus. So he's responding to this guy's question of if you can do anything, if you can. So Jesus is having this conversation, and I don't know, maybe this is shown up in The Chosen, maybe this is a scene, or maybe it's a scene still to come, but can you picture Jesus like, if you can? What does that mean? But he doesn't come out and say, don't you dare question me. He just says, if you can. And then he explains everything is possible for one who believes. In some ways, he's like, okay, so if you can, if I can, well, how about if you can? If you can believe, you can. Immediately, the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe, but help me with my unbelief. That's a memory verse right there, right? When we're struggling with whatever we're questioning, we're like, if you can, help me with my unbelief. Because I believe, but I don't know if I fully believe yet. The dad's struggling, and so he prays, help me with my unbelief. That's a prayer. It's a call to action. Lord Jesus, I want to trust you, but I'm not sure. Help me. Help me trust you. And so then the dad prayed for help. Jesus, help me with my unbelief. He didn't simply ask Jesus for an answer. He asked Jesus to act. And that's the difference between questioning and praying. When we question, we just want to know more. We want to ask God something. But that should move us to wanting God to do something about our situation too. And so how does Jesus respond to this one? Does he come back and say, well, come back to me later when you're more serious? When, the man says, help me in my unbelief. And Jesus doesn't say, okay, when you believe more, come back. That's not what he says. He doesn't say, hey, why don't you come back when you're better prepared? When you know what you really want, when you can really ask me for something, then you come back to me. Jesus doesn't say that. He doesn't say, hey, when you have the faith, at least the size of a mustard seed, when you have just at least a little bit of faith, then come back. No. Jesus simply acknowledges the dad's question, and he hears his prayer, and he casts out the demon. And in doing so, he helped build the dad's faith. He helped him in his unbelief. So how good is Jesus? He helps him in his unbelief. He does something incredible with Jesus in that moment, or with this man in that moment. So what do you do? What do we do when we find it difficult to trust a God that we can't see? Like when you face a problem you don't understand. Well, you question, you ask, you pray, you seek, and then you surrender, which is you knock. What does it mean to surrender? It means as you grow in your faith, you're going to choose to trust God even when you don't understand. Because sometimes you ask, and you either don't like the answer or don't see the answer, you don't get it right away. So then you seek understanding, you pray, you ask God to act, and it just doesn't seem like he acts according to our will. Like, we want him to be like Siri. And the truth is, he's probably more like Siri than we want, because we ask him to do something and Siri says, no, that's not in my skill set. Everything's in God's skill set, but Siri is lacking in those things. But sometimes God's like, no, that's not what you want. That is not what you want. You just don't know what you want yet. One of my favorite scriptures about trust is, you probably have this memorized, probably one of your favorites too, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, right? Trust in the Lord with all your heart. And lean not on your own understanding, and in all your ways submit to him, and he will make your paths straight. It's the middle part of that that gives me the struggle, right? Trust in the Lord with all my heart, easy. Lean not on my own understanding, harder, right? That part grabs my attention because I think I ought to be able to think and come up with a solution. But when you've been through something where not only you can't come up with a solution, the doctors can't come up with a solution, the politicians can't come up with a solution, you know what I mean? Like, solutions are hard to find. It's beyond our understanding. Then you have to lean on something else. You can't lean on your own understanding. So what's the problem with our understanding? Well, our understanding is limited. Sometimes life just does not make sense to us. And that's the time we need to seek a new understanding of life, a higher understanding of life. You ever do anything you thought was a good idea and it wasn't? You're probably not going to like this illustration, but I took out a really long story to go with this short one that I thought might connect with you better. I was going to tell you a long story about a time I struggled with, made a stupid decision, and there were two problems with that. One is I just couldn't pick one because there's so many. The other is it was just really long and maybe unrelatable. So let me go with this one. How many of you are struggling with seeing these videos from Hurricane Helene? I would guess your struggle with that and my struggle with that are very different, having not lived through a hurricane before. But I see the videos coming and the pictures from Florida. And I kind of understand that. Like there's just a part of people from South Dakota that says, you live in Florida, you're going to get hurricanes. Why should I think Why should I think this is a disaster for you? This is a routine for you. This is something you should be prepared for. I'm just telling you how Yankees think about the South. Like, what? Why do you keep living there and moving there? You should live somewhere like Tennessee where a hurricane would not have any power whatsoever. Until it does. I sent Chris and Carrie a text yesterday and just said, hey, I'm thinking about how are yours doing? Because they've got kids back in our neck of the woods where we used to live. Matter of fact, the church that I served in seminary was on the old Jonesboro Highway. And if you've seen video from the old Jonesboro Highway, there's bridges out and there's water over the roadways and stuff. It's not like Asheville, North Carolina bad, but it's bad. We have friends that live in Asheville. I texted one of my friends who's 30 minutes from there. He was a partner in ministry with me before we moved here. And I said, Marcus, are you doing all right? He said, yeah, we probably won't have power for a couple of weeks, but we're okay. That doesn't sound okay, but we're okay. And that's because he knows what it's like down the road from him where some of his people from the church are. They're going through their Harvey. Those of us more accustomed to blizzards than hurricanes watch the footage and we ask, why would anybody want to live there? Kind of like you do when you see footage of a blizzard and there's snow over top of your car. Why would anybody want to live there? But the bigger question I think a lot of people start to have, even locals, like, why didn't these people evacuate? Right? And having lived through a hurricane where you may or may not have evacuated, you're probably more understanding of that. You're probably like, oh, yeah, I know why they didn't evacuate. Because if they evacuated, they'd be evacuating every couple of months, 3 or 4 times a year. How do they know which one to actually believe? I don't know, maybe you can help answer these questions for me. But this is what it's like to have limited understanding. I think that's why people don't evacuate or didn't evacuate. These people that live in the mountains of Tennessee, not having really had this experience of this type of storm, they have limited understanding. When we lived there in March of 1993 or 4, something like that, they got 12 inches of snow in Johnson City, Tennessee. It was a record snowfall. In Iowa, in Nebraska and South Dakota, the other places we had lived prior to that blizzard, we didn't call off school for 12 inches of snow. We didn't even have a 2-hour late start most of the time. I remember in high school when we had a bad blizzard, my buddy and I were on our way to school at 6:30 in the morning. We had to get stuff ready for a concert that was going on, and we were on the lighting crew. And so we went in early, and they called off school between the time we left the house and the time we got to school. And we didn't have cell phones. We just got there and the doors were locked. We couldn't get in. And so we turned on the radio in the parking lot, listened for a while, and I said, hey, the roads are too dangerous. We can't have these students driving to school. So you know what we did the rest of that morning? My buddy Ian and I took off in his pickup and we went and pulled people out of ditches all day because it was super icy. And that's the way we did blizzards in South Dakota. Like if your vehicle would move, you went and helped people with vehicles that didn't move. That's the way we dealt with it. Kind of like when you have a hurricane, when your place isn't flooded out, you help the people whose places are flooded out. We just do these things together. But the people in Tennessee for 2 weeks, it was shut down with 12 inches of snow. The snow was long gone, and there were still people without power, and there were still people trapped in their trailers in the mountains. And I was like, how can this be? It was because they didn't have any understanding. Their understanding was limited. They didn't know what to do when a blizzard came. They didn't know how to prepare for the storm. And I think that's probably true for some of these people in Asheville, North Carolina. It's like, we've never experienced a 1,000-year flood. Well, I think we have here, right? Wasn't Harvey a 1,000-year incident? It was at least 500 year, but I think it was a 1,000-year incident. It's like, once you've experienced that, you have more understanding. You have a different response to it, a different action to it. But when your understanding is limited, like ours is in almost every facet of our life, because our ideas and thoughts fit in this little container right here, actually smaller than that. And those of us that played football or tumbling or soccer and injured that brain, our understanding is probably even smaller. Or those of us that, you name it, have caused problems with our brain, our guys, it's even less accessible to us. And we get out there and we think, well, until it makes sense to my limited little pea-sized brain, I'm not going to trust it. And that's not the way it works. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. It's limited. In all these ways, acknowledge Him, and He's going to straighten this thing out. He's going to walk with you in this path. He's going to empower you to go through this. Bottom line is, we know what we know, but we don't know what we don't know. But God does. Why do we do that? Put our trust in our understanding, which is so limited. Like when we go to the doctors, like, okay, I've educated myself. I've been on WebMD. I did a search on Google. I, called Ask a Nurse or whatever it is that you do when you're like, I got to figure out what's going on with me. And you go to the doctor and you tell the doctor, okay, this is how I want you to treat me. I've got this, and it's my understanding that means you need to treat me with this. So give me this. Is that how you go to your doctor? Sometimes I'd probably be better off doing it that way because they're just what, Dalvin? Practicing. Yeah. But that tends to be the way that we go to the doctor? No. But that tends to be the way we go to the Lord. Okay, Lord, I've got this issue. I'm struggling with it this way, and I need you to do this. And He's like, you don't even have the right problem, and you're coming to me with the solution. Right? The alternative is you choose to trust, even though you don't understand the details. The Hebrew word translated as trust in this proverb is batak. All right. I didn't say that very well. I'm a little dry. I'll look up and see if I can hit one of the Marys this time. Batak. That's the word. You don't have to know how to say it, but you should know what it is. Batak in the Lord. Trust in the Lord. Here's what that word means. It means to stretch out and lay face down before God in reverence before the King. It doesn't mean do your own thing with confidence. It just means submit fully to His will. Full trust. I don't know if you've ever seen some churches have a practice when they ordain a pastor. When you go through your ordination, take, for example, the Catholic Church. Have you ever seen the ordination of a priest? This is what they do. They lay themselves down on the ground and they lay themselves out like this. And it's for quite a period of time. And it's not just to show off their incredible planking abilities. It's to say, I fully surrender and I just want to trust you, God. Batak. It represents a servant waiting for the master's will or command. And when you trust, that's what you're doing. You're surrendering to the master, who surrendered his own will. Jesus put himself, entrusted himself to the Father. He said, and if possible, let this cup pass from me, but not my will, but I surrender to yours. And he wept. He sweat tears. And he went to the cross as a yes. So how do we do that practically? What does it mean to trust God with all of our hearts? I think let's remember a couple things about what that does not mean. First, let's understand that trusting God does not mean that you always get what you want. It's not that you lay down and you pound your hands and knees and fists like a little toddler in the Walmart who wants a piece of candy. And the parent says, no. No, you submit. It doesn't mean that nothing bad is ever going to happen to you. Jesus promises, believers who trust in me, who follow me, bad things are in store for them. But what it means is trusting God means that God loves you and you trust that. He's working all things for your good, like Romans says. Romans 8:28 simply says, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who've been called according to his purpose. So how do you trust in God? A God you can't see? Well, you ask, you seek, pray, and you knock, you surrender.